Hey everyone, welcome to this Maxon Fundamentals workshop. My name is Ellie and I'm a senior trainer here at Maxon. And throughout this series, you'll be getting up and running in Cinema 4D and Redshift and creating your own Waffles scene just like this one. So whether you're a student, a beginner, or just interested in getting into 3D, then this is definitely the workshop for you. We'll be diving into the fundamentals of both Cinema 4D and Redshift, looking at navigation, modeling, animation, as well as lighting, texturing, and rendering. A few important things before we get up and running is this is actually a pre-recorded live stream, but don't worry, I'm also here in the chat with you to answer any questions that you need. Also, if you're watching the recording and you want to get in touch, feel free to ask your questions at training@maxon.net, or feel free to DM me on Instagram. I am at itwasellie, and that's Ellie with a Y. I'll be putting together an FAQ document of all the questions that you asked throughout this entire series, as well as full access to the project files, which you can actually access and download now in the description of this video. In this second episode, we're going to dive into lighting and composition. So we're going to start off by actually modeling the rest of our scene, looking at things inside of the asset browser. Then we're going to dive into Redshift cameras to build our composition. And then finally looking at that all-important lighting inside of Redshift. Let's get started.
Okay, so let's look at doing some lighting and composition on our Waffles scene. As you can see, we're starting off pretty much from exactly where we left off in the first part of the session. We have our remeshed waffle object here, and now we're going to look at starting to build a little bit of a scene and a little bit of a composition. So the first thing I'm actually going to do is I want to have this as a single object. So I don't really want to have to worry too much about changing any of these elements. And the way that we can then do that is on our remesh, if we right click, we have loads of different options here, but the important one is current state to object. If I do that, let me pull this down slightly. We then get this null with our new object. So if I just sort of pull this out, we can then see we get this new waffle object. And what we can actually do is let's just copy that. Let's just paste that into a new scene. So we can see here we have this single object now. We no longer have access to all of those different layers, but that's fine. I don't need those. I just want this. And let's just call this waffle 1. And let's make my icons a bit bigger. And what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to have 3 different versions of this waffle. And so let's just delete that. And if you remember from the first part of the session, we actually set this up in a way where we can easily add and change the random seed to change how this looks. So for now, let me just disable my remesh. And in my random field, I'm just going to set a different seed value. I'm going to do the same thing in my random effector. Set a new seed value. And then also perhaps in my displacer, under shading, click this little option again, and then change this seed value again to something that I'm happy with. Then if we remesh this, again, it's going to have to calculate. But what I now have is a variation of that original waffle. And so again, when we talk about, randomness, variation, all of this helps sell this to look a little bit more realistic. So I've remeshed this again. I can copy and paste this into my new scene, set that to waffle 2. Let's just do it one final time. Because what we're going to do, we're going to create a box of these waffles, have some on the floor. And so having this variation is really going to help us. Let me switch my remesh off first and then do this and then just set these values. I'm just changing these kind of randomly, really, just so I know everything looks a little bit different. Yeah, let's go with that one. Back on the remesh. And then for a final time, we're just going to current state this to object. And then we've got 3 different waffles that we can kind of play around with. So let's current state to object that for the final time. pull this one in, paste that, and then we have the third one. Brilliant. Okay, so we're going to be working in this new scene now, so we don't necessarily need this one anymore, so I could just save that and then I can close that. And we're going to be working in this new scene, so let me just go to File, Save As, and then let's set it to O2, Making Waffles, so you have access to all of these project files. Let's set this to lighting. Okay. So now we have our 3 different waffles all in the same place, but looking slightly different. And something I do want to do, I want to build this composition with real world scaling. And what I mean by that is I want to be creating these waffles to be roughly or approximately the same size that they are in real life. And my reason behind this is because when it then comes to lighting and composition, it makes things behave in a more realistic manner. So the intensities and the size of our lights will be having a more physical and realistic effect, as well as things like the focal lengths and the depth of field within our cameras will again be working far more like they would be in the real world. So if I highlight over my waffles, we have this little option down here, this little hot corner. If I just click that, we can see, if I click one of the individual objects, we actually get the sizing of that in centimeters. So at the moment, we can see it's quite big in size. And we did that because we used Cinema 4D's default scaling, which is fine. But for this, let's just grab all of these and let's just hold T, and we're going to scale down. Let's scale down to maybe 15%. So you can see in the middle there, we have that percentage value. And then now if I click these, let's go a little bit smaller. A little bit smaller again. Okay, so we've got roughly, I want to get them to roughly 10 centimeters. There we go, perfect. So remember, again, if I press the S button, it's going to sort of focus on the object I have selected. So now my waffles are roughly 10 centimeters in size, which is roughly, you know, the size that they would be perhaps if they were in the real world. Brilliant. So what we want to do is we want to build up a little bit of a composition, because at the moment we could light and texture these, but we might not have a really nice looking final scene or a final shot. So what we want to do is, first of all, we actually want to define our composition or our output resolution. And we can do this by coming into our render settings. So this little menu up the top here, if we click that, we can see we get our render settings. And this is something we'll be diving into in part 4 of this fundamentals workshop. We'll be looking at how we can render, create an animation, render out a still frame. But what we do want to do is we need to define this composition first. So in the output, so we're under the output here, we can set this to whatever we like. If you want to be working with like Instagram reels, so 9:16, or maybe a 1:1 ratio, all of that can be defined in here. But for me, what we'll do is we'll do the HD 16:9, so 1920 by 1080. And now that's what we have in our viewport. So a quick piece of information here, everything that is sort of shown behind this darker bar, these are our safe frames. This won't be rendered. So we need to make sure we're building our composition in this lighter area. So let's build a bit of a nicer looking scene. So the first thing I'm going to do, back in my primitive shapes, we have this backdrop option. And we've created this backdrop in our scene that just creates a nice background. It creates a nice floor. And it also helps us with some nice light bouncing too. Next up, we can begin to add and build some more elements. So we could model them in the same way that we did in the first part of this workshop. Or what we can do is we can actually take advantage of Cinema 4D's asset browser. So that can be found in this menu here. If I just click that to open it up, this is the asset browser, and it is an extremely powerful tool inside of C4D. Not only do we have access to different materials, but we also have access to different textures. So the sort of things that we're going to look at in part 3 when we do some texturing. But we also have access to models. So loads and loads of different models. If I just sort of enlarge these so you can see them a bit clearer, we have a variety of different models, all textured and ready to go in our scenes. And you'll notice when I hover over one of them, if you have this little Redshift icon, what this means is it's optimized and textured, ready for Redshift. So one thing I do want to comment on this is dependent on the version that you have access to will depend on which assets you have available. So because I'm in my Max on 1 subscription, I have access to all of the assets. But if you're on the trial or if you're on the student license, you might find that you have some slightly different ones. But you should still have access to some models and some materials and textures. So definitely have a look in there and begin to build your scene up. For me, what I want to do is I actually know the object that I want to find. And so we have this handy little search bar at the top, and I can search for a box. And if I come down, there should be something called the modular box. Here we go. So this one here. So to bring this asset into my scene and to download it, I can just double click. It's already downloaded in my scene, but what you might find is yours will need to download. It shouldn't take too long, depending on your internet. Then I can close my asset browser, and we now have this box in my scene. So this is a cool little asset because it has some really fun espresso sort of parameters set up, but we don't have to worry about what those mean. All it means is we have access to these really cool parameters that we can adjust and we can change. So I can bring up this top panel, we can adjust the side or the kind of like front of these flaps if we want to. And we can even adjust the size of the box. So we can control the width, the depth, and the height. So you can really begin to customize these assets for your own. So what I will do is let me just pull this panel all the way open because I want it to look like these sort of waffles are sort of filling this box. That's my idea for this composition. So let's just move these waffles up. So we can see that they're roughly the right kind of sizing. So we can see here, we can see that they're pretty good for the sizing. And what I do want to do is I'm actually going to copy and paste. So with all those selected, I've copied and pasted those. And now we have 6 of these waffles in my scene. And we can place them inside of this box really, really easily. And I want to show you how we can do that. With them all selected, we have a few different placement tools. So first of all, let me show you the normal placement tool. And so what this is going to allow me to do is going to allow me to place the object I have selected onto the surface of an object. So we have our backdrop, which is working as our floor. With our first waffle selected, we can click the place tool. And then if I just click, it's actually placing this on the surface. If I just sort of like have a little look, we can see it's actually on the surface. We can rotate that and scale it, and it's still going to remain on the surface. Let's pull that back in, because what's even cooler is the next tool, which is the dynamic place tool. So what this does is it effectively looks at these objects I have selected as dynamic objects, and then as I then place them in my scene, they are acting and being sort of collided with one another. And so we can play around and we can just sort of move these objects around and start to have some fun and create a look that we're happy with. And we could even rotate these around, something like this. Maybe even scale them up slightly. There we go. So again, spend a little bit of more time on this if you want to and find a look that you are perfectly happy with. We could even copy and paste one final one and maybe place that on the floor in front. And now we've basically created a slightly more interesting looking composition. So what originally was just this single waffle in the scene, we've now got our backdrop, we've got our little box of waffles, and we've got one perhaps just on the outside as if it's fallen out here. From here, what we can do is we can now actually introduce a Redshift camera where we can actually look through that, and that's where we can define our final look or our final composition ready for some lighting and some texturing. So let's just organize our scene a little bit more. Let's highlight all of our waffle objects, and then we can group these inside of a null. So very similar to what we did in the first part, but I'm going to show you a little trick. So instead of having to take the null object itself and then drag and drop them into that null, with everything selected, you can press Option or Alt-G. And what it does is it groups them all for us. And we can title this Waffles. And now we have our scene. Brilliant. So from here, let's begin to incorporate Redshift, add a camera, and then finally add some lighting into our scene. So the way that we can add a Redshift camera is actually this little button here. So if I just highlight over this button, we can click it to create a camera. And then what we need to do next, in order to be able to reposition this camera, or reposition it easily, we can actually click this little view icon here. This will now go white, and you'll also notice that we are now looking through our Redshift camera as opposed to our default camera. So now as I use my 1, 2, and 3 shortcuts, I'm now able to reposition this Redshift camera and find that final look or that final still image and composition that we're looking to create. Before I do that though, let's take a little look in the Redshift camera. So we have loads and loads of different options in here. Some we'll get to during this workshop, but others we won't, and we can cover in future videos and tutorials. So under the Object tab, this is where we want to begin, adjusting the focal length of our camera. And we can do a few different things. So we could go really low and we can create more of a wide look. And then as we get closer, we'll be able to see we have this really great looking wide angle and creating some distortion. Or we can go in the other direction for a more portrait or macro look. And in this case, we won't get any distortion, but we will need to make sure that we pan out a little bit more. And then we can start to find perhaps a look that we think looks great. If, like me, you're not the most familiar when it comes to composition, then there are some handy little things that we can use inside of the Redshift camera. So with it selected, if we just go to display, we have some handy little composition overlays. So we could apply a grid. We can apply the golden spiral. All of these are going to help us really kind of begin to understand composition, how it works, and then overall just help us create a more interesting look. So let's perhaps go something like this, and then let's just get a little bit closer here and find a shot that we're happy with. What's great is we can change this at any point, but for me, what I will do is I like to define my composition first, because then when we do our lighting, it's very dependent on our final composition. So I want to be lighting the scene based off of this shot or this angle here. So let's leave this like this. Maybe we can just Command or Control S to save. And now we're ready for some lighting. A few things I want to talk about first of all. If you want to lock your camera, so if you're worried about accidentally moving the camera, we can right click on our camera and then we have a protection tag. So under rigging, we have a protection tag, and this will actually prevent us from moving our camera. So you'll notice when I try and do 1, 2, and 3, which I'm trying to do now, I'm not actually moving around my scene. If we do want to move around our scene, but we don't want to move our camera, make sure you just click out of the view, and now we can move around and our main Redshift camera will stay there. And we can go back in. Brilliant. So again, a little bit of a recap. What we've done is we created some single objects of the waffle that we created in part 1. We added some variation, so we have 3 different types, which we've then duplicated and placed in our scene. We added a backdrop, and also we took the modular box from the asset browser where we can find loads of different models, materials, and textures. And then we've thrown in our Redshift camera to define the look of what our final render will be at the end of this series. Let's now dive into a little bit of what exactly Redshift is. So Redshift is the inbuilt render engine, also the default render engine inside of Cinema 4D. So if you have access to the latest version of Cinema 4D, you will also have Redshift included. We can see that we have Redshift. If we again click our render settings, we have our renderer drop down, and then we should have Redshift here. Or you should be able to click it down and then choose Redshift. We can also see inside of our preferences, which we can find under Edit and then Preferences. And then under Renderer, we should have Redshift. This will give you the version as well as the CPU or GPU devices that you are using, as well as some other tools which we won't really need to go into today. What we also have is a Redshift menu. So along our toolbar at the top, for some of you it may be in the toolbar at the very top. I've moved mine inside of Cinema 4D. We have all of our Redshift tools and features and functions that we would need, including the Redshift render view. So if I just open up my Redshift render view, we get a second window. And what this is it's actually an interactive preview or progressive version of our render. So what you will find when we work inside of Redshift and Cinema 4D, the viewport isn't a 100% accurate like for like. As we create materials and as we create our lights, you'll notice that our viewport versus our final render look very, very different. So the render view is a really nice medium where we get a preview of our final render, but it's not as accurate. So it's not a 100% final render, but what it is it is a far more accurate preview of how our final shot will look. We can use the 3 lines or the hamburger menu to then apply it into our layout. So you'll notice as I'm moving this around, hopefully you can see this little white line. If I just let go here, we now have our viewport and our render view all in my same layout. And a few handy tools inside of here, or a few handy buttons. Most importantly is this one here. This is the start or stop IPR. If I click that, we will now see, it'll just take a few seconds to load. We now have this in our scene. So let me just delete these original materials that have come on the asset. So let me just delete those. There we go. So that looks a little bit better. And now we're getting this preview. I can then pause that by clicking it again. And it's going to give us a nice preview. One little handy tip, if you don't have a lot of space, let's say you're working on perhaps a laptop and not like a large screen, you can actually use this Redshift menu on this window and you can start the IPR and it turns your viewport into the IPR this time. And it works in the same way. Again, it's slightly less accurate, the render view, but it gives us this nice preview ready for now adding lights and materials. So my preference is the render view, so I'll be working with this one. And the important thing to remember is if I want to be moving around to come out of my camera, and you'll see how this updates, and then I need to make sure I'm moving in my viewport, not in my render view. So make sure I'm still sort of moving around inside of here. Okay, so let's come back into here and let's begin working with some Redshift lighting. So first of all, where can we find our Redshift lights and what can we do with them? Well, where that we can find them is this little menu down here. So if I click and hold, these are all of our Redshift specific lights. And this is the important factor when it comes to working with Redshift. We need to make sure we're using Redshift lights. And we have a few different options here. So we have a few different light types and a few different ways that we can begin to add lighting to our scene. One of the first ways is what we call image-based lighting. And that is taking a dome light. So if I just select the dome light, this is an infinite texture mapped area light. So it's basically a ginormous white, bright environment light. But what we can do with the dome light is we can apply a HDRI image, which is really great for easy, high quality lighting. And then we can take advantage of the asset browser again, and we can search for a HDRI image. And again, based on your license will depend on the options you have available, the assets you have available in here. I believe we all have access to these Light Studio HDRIs. So maybe I will use one of these ones just so we can all follow along nice and easily. Maybe I'll take this one here. So this Light Studio 21. And the way that we can use this with our dome light, if I just switch on my render view, with my dome light enabled, I can drag and drop it into this path. So let's just drag this number 21 into this path. And then now we can see we're now lighting our scene with this dome light and with this HDR. And so what can we do from here? Well, if I just come out of my Redshift camera, I want to show you another little trick. We can actually lock my Redshift render view. Even though I'm not viewing it here, I can view it inside of here. So let me just reopen that and close that. I just had that little HDR there, the text there. So I've just opened that and closed that so we don't see that anymore. And in my dome light, we can take advantage of just rotating it because this image is now being mapped on my dome light, on my environment. So as I just rotate this round, you can see in my render view how we're able to create some interesting lighting purely by using the dome light and the HDR. Maybe we can sort of rotate it around a little further. and have it coming in just from this left-hand side, creating some nice contrast in here. A few more options inside of my dome light, if we scroll down, is we have intensity and we have exposure. The intensity is the intensity of the light, so we can increase this to make it brighter. We can decrease this to make it less intense. And exposure works as a multiplier. So if we set this to a value of 1, we will be doubling the light intensity. To a value of 2, we'll be quadrupling it, etc. We can also go into negative values as well. If you happen to be using a texture map that has some kind of color into it, we can actually control our color settings on our hue, saturation, and gamma down inside of here. Okay, so we've added some ambient lighting to our scene, but now how can we begin to create more lighting, to create more depth, more contrast, and overall help pull focus to certain areas of our composition? We can do that by adding in some point source lighting or some physical lights. Again, these can be found in that same menu. And we're going to be working with area lights today. So I'm just going to select an area light. And now we can see it's actually been added into my scene. But what I need to do is I actually need to resize, reposition, and readjust this area light in order to get some slightly nicer lighting. So the first thing that I like to do is I actually like to switch off my dome light, because I want this area light to be the only thing lighting my scene, so I can really see in my render view what exactly it's doing. And in my area light, again, a handy little tip for you, this little drop down button here, if we click that, we have a really great retargeting option. So if I select this, we get a few different things. We get a target tag added to my light, which can be found when we right click and go to animation, can be found in here. And we also have this null object, which is linked to my target. So what this means, if I go into my foreviews, if I move this around, you'll notice that my light is actually always going to be facing that null. So if I just reposition this null roughly where I want my lights to be pointing, I can now click my area light and I can reposition my area light, and it's always going to focus and be pointing at my target object or my target null. So instead of having to worry about rotating this myself, this little setup is doing it all for me. Brilliant. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on a 3-point lighting setup. And it's a setup that you can use in so many different aspects of 3D, so many different scenes, and it's all going to be using the same kind of information. So you can take this, the foundations of this lighting setup, and you can use it across many different scenes that you can now create in 3D. And so we're going to start off with creating a key light. So we've got our area light here, and I'm just going to rename this key. This is going to be our main light. And we're going to position this at roughly a 45-degree angle. So from our camera to our object, which is 90 degrees, 45 would be roughly in here. And so at the moment, if we look at our render view, we can see that everything is very bright, very white, and very overexposed. So what we want to do is we need to dive back into those settings, so back into our light settings, and start to adjust and play with these settings to create a nicer look. So the first thing I actually want to do is I want to come down to this shape area. So we can define the shape of our light source. So the default is rectangle, which we're actually going to leave that on. And then we can define the size. And so at the moment we can see this little handy wireframe. So we can see the size of our light. If I just set this to something smaller, so something slightly more realistic like you would have in a studio, and perhaps we can pull that up, we've been able to create some main lighting inside of here. And then what we can do is we can then take a look at our intensity and our exposure. So again, the intensity is the intensity of our light, and we can go past 100 if we want to. And then our exposure works as a multiplier. So don't be afraid to go into negative values as well. If you want to, we can apply color to our light. So we can colorize this by just clicking this little color swatch, and then we could incorporate some color if we want to. Again, we might want to go really, low with these values if you want to create some more interesting color effects. But let's just leave this on white for now. And I'm happy with how this is. So we created our key light. From here, because I've got this all set up now, I've got this set up with the target tag and with the null and with the sizing, I'm just going to duplicate it. And this is going to become my backlighting. And what I'll do is I'm just going to flip this round to the back and then make sure we pull that up. And then we're just going to look at creating some backlighting here to pull it off of this base. So let me, again, switch off my key light because I just want to be seeing what this backlight is doing. And then maybe we can kind of pull this round and just look at, again, adding just a little bit of lighting to the back and then maybe to the rim of my objects. And maybe I could even pull that down a touch and then perhaps pull that a little bit closer and pull that up. Okay. So we've got our key light and we have our backlight. The final source of lighting will be our fill light, and that will complete our 3-point lighting setup. Copy and paste again. And then just set this to fill. And this is going to fill out just some of those darker areas. So where we maybe have too much contrast, too much shadow, and we don't have a lot of light showing, we can just bring that around. So if I'm thinking of these areas here, I probably need to have it roughly this side of my light, or this side of my camera and of my object. So something perhaps a little bit like this. And again, maybe I can pull this down just a touch. And now if we bring them all in, we can see that we've created some nice lighting here. We've got some nice depth and some nice contrast in some of these shaded areas. And we can even bring back our dome light as well to again really highlight and exaggerate some more of those little areas inside of here. We could even continue to play with the intensity of our dome light or our other lights just to get a final look that we're happy with. Okay, really quickly, let's do a recap. And I do want to talk about one quick thing. So if I come back into my main perspective view, you'll notice that it's quite a dark scene. As soon as we begin adding Redshift lights, we kind of lose the ability to see much in our shot. So what we can do is we can actually go to display and quick shading, and then we're able to bring that back and bring that nice view back that we are used to. So let's go back into my Redshift camera and let's take a little look at this. So again, to recap, we rebuilt a bit of our scene. looking at the Waffles, the dynamic place tools, so these ones here, the backdrop and the box from our asset browser. We then brought in the Redshift camera, and then we started to play around with some lighting. So we've added a dome light from our Redshift lights menu, which can be found in here. We added that HDR image. So we have image-based lighting our scene now. And again, this was found in our asset browser. And then we incorporated some point source lighting and some physical lights, which are our area lights. And we created a 3-point lighting system. So we have our key light, which if we just switch everything off, we have our key light adding some lighting again at a 45-degree angle from our camera. Maybe we could pull that around just a touch. We then have our back or our rim light, just pulling this off of any kind of background. And then we're filling out some of those darker shadowed areas. And then altogether, it works nicely to create some really great, interesting lighting. A few final things I want to talk about on the subject of lighting before we wrap this up is understanding the size of your lights are also very, very important. So if I switch off my dome light and I switch off my fill and my back, at the moment, we're only lighting the scene through this key light. If I increase the size to 100 by 100, you'll notice that not only did this light source get bigger, but the light intensity was also increased as well. So the size of your lights will affect the intensity, and it will also affect how the shadows are. So if you have large light sources, you will create harder and harsher shadows. So if we think about the sun, that's a ginormous light source very far away, and that creates really hard shadows. Very small light sources will then create softer shadows. So remember that and bear that in mind when you are also lighting your scene. And therefore the size and the intensity will be relative to the size of your objects and the size of your scene. A few other quick things before we wrap up is if we just come back into here. At the moment, we don't have any textures in our scene. And this is really, really important because the way light and light bouncing works is objects that are bright in our scene, so textures that are brighter, will create more light bouncing and therefore will create brighter scenes. Objects and textures that are darker will absorb light, therefore we will have less light bouncing and less light intensity in our scene. So what we can do to kind of counteract this, if we're doing our lighting first, like we are in this workshop, is there's a little handy mode inside of the render view, which is the clay mode. And what it does is it applies a clay render or a clay material all over our render. And so we can see exactly how this light is looking as opposed to it kind of being affected by the light or the dark textures in our scene if we have them. So remember some of those top tips and remember the things we talked about when it comes to looking at intensity and exposure. The size of our light is important. If we want to color it, we can do. If we find our viewport has gone dark, it's our quick shading lines. And then don't forget, we can always use the handy little targeting trick here to target our lights nice and easily. And a lot of this is down to you as an artist, the style of scene that you're creating and the type of mood that you want to create, whether we want to have, fun and playful, or we go kind of like dark and moody, perhaps we only have it backlit. This is down to you to really kind of perfect your lighting in your scene by using some of these simple tips and tricks, and enjoy, lighting your own scene. I'm looking forward to seeing them. And I will see you on part 3 when we dive into some Redshift texturing. See you then.